on sabbatical a few years ago, and Ken is a real idea factory, and he is someone who does many different things all at once. He's not just an oceanographer, but he's also a climatologist. He's studied all kinds of interesting interactions between terrestrial biosphere, climate, ocean acidification. He's done many things. Ken actually started out on Wall Street. Ken was a software developer. Sounds kind of not so interesting, but Ken was actually there. He was out trying to find the cheaters. Okay, but after a while, Ken told me that apparently the people on Wall Street, they weren't so interested in trying to find the cheaters. The era when he was there in the early, just in the 90s. It's unfortunate, perhaps, for Wall Street that Ken wasn't there in the past few years, because I think perhaps with all his interest and many skills, I think he perhaps would have been able to track what was going on. But that was a road, untrodden path. But Ken will be telling us more about the science today and the interaction between the science and the policy in terms of iron fertilization. But one more thing I should tell you about Ken. He was one of the handful of scientists in 2008 which New Scientist, the magazine, named as a hero scientist of 2008. Now Ken is a hero because he's one of the few who's dared to go and take geoengineering by the horns and really try to address and not be too afraid of what his colleagues might think, and actually jump in and try and test all kinds of ideas that have been put out, and some of his own ideas as to what might be done and how efficient it might be. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our hero scientist to talk to us about iron fertilization.
Thank you, Jim. I think when this session was originally set up, the idea was that I was supposed to be in favor of these geoengineering schemes, and John was supposed to be opposed to them. And I think, unfortunately, you're going to get a little less of a dichotomy than anticipated by the organizers. That I'm a strong advocate of scientific research and of science as the foundation for sound public policy. I'm really not a fan of geoengineering schemes per se, in that I actually think the end conclusion of all this research is that we're going to need to redouble our efforts to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. But I think it's not appropriate to discount these schemes just because we have an emotional reaction against them, but we need to have actual facts and information so that we can weigh these ideas in a rational way. And unless we do the science to provide that factual foundation, the debate will just be at the level of emotion. So I think there's really been a turn of events over the last half century, perhaps since the creation of nuclear weapons. And if you look around us, so much of what we have depends on scientific and technical research. That our food, heat things in microwave ovens, and we have LED lights and flying in airplanes and so on. And all of this is a product of centuries of scientific and technological research. And so, while people are going on television, which is the product itself of all kinds of scientific and technical research, people are going on television and denouncing the scientific enterprise as damaging and destructive. And so I think there's been a real shift in the last half century of scientists viewed as really the creators of the modern world to people who are capable of destroying the world. And I think that really, I think the beginning of this process was really probably the development of nuclear weapons. I think the whole issue of genetic engineering and GMO crops have also frightened people. that the energy production systems, I'm saying there, both the carbon dioxide from the fossil fuel system and also nuclear power has generated a lot of opposition. And now, finally, the marine scientists get to be included in this category because of fears related to ocean fertilization. And I think the driving force that has put marine scientists in this position have been the efforts to commercialize ocean fertilization. There are two companies that, Planktos has now gone out of business, and Climos is reorganizing. But both of these companies have sought to add iron to the ocean and then sell, then claim carbon storage. How they were going to verify that is unclear. And then sell those carbon credits most likely to voluntary markets, because it's likely that the regulated markets under the UNFCCC process would not have accepted these credits. And as a result of the activities of these commercial organizations and fears of widespread use of a global commons in an unregulated way, that this has caused various environmental organizations and governments to react by attempting to suppress all iron fertilization experiments, and by extension, direct manipulation experiments in the ocean generally. And so there's been an overreaction that is now leading to the suppression of scientific research. Over the past weeks, I think on January 7th, this polar stern sailed into the Southern Ocean to try to do an iron fertilization experiment supported by both the German and Indian governments. The proposal was to put in I think 25 tons of iron, but let's say in terms of elemental iron, approximately 10 tons of iron, which is roughly around 10 to 20 seconds worth of the natural dust input into the ocean. Of course, it's localized, so it's not directly comparable. And various non-governmental organizations put out all kinds of messages about this experiment. And one particular vocal group is this ETC group from Canada, who has been putting out position papers as news releases. But here it's calling it a geoengineering ship, and amid a growing storm of protests stretching across 4 continents, and calls to halt its controversial ocean fertilization experiment, that the geoengineers on board ignore the will of the masses and proceed to dump iron in the ocean. And anyway, let's just leave it there. So I think, it's been scientists for the first time, I think, at least marine scientists for the first time, have been put in this category of enemies of the environment, where the environmental organizations are representing themselves as protectors of the environment, and in many cases are, and marine scientists are being lumped in, along with profit-driven organizations, as enemies of the environment. And I think it's critical that marine scientists avoid this characterization of the position, and that that I think it's essential that marine scientists be viewed as protectors of the environment, and these and that manipulative experiments of the ocean be seen as in support of environmental goals and not opposed to broader environmental goals. So I guess the central question here is, will intentional ocean fertilization help us to protect our environment? And just yesterday, there was a paper published in Nature looking at a natural ocean fertilization experiment, looking at the result of dust input to the ocean and export of export of biomass from this. And if we look at the results of this paper locally, that there was, in the area that received the natural iron fertilization, there was increased export to depth, say below the euphotic zone, of a few hundred, or say on the order of 100 millimoles per meter squared per year. Now, this is probably an upper bound estimate in that, as Anand Gnanadesikan first pointed out in his papers over a half-decade ago, that when you do an iron fertilization, you also consume macronutrients, and some of those macronutrients would have been used at a later date somewhere else to support export. And so any locally measured increase in export must be an overestimate of the total increase in export if you consider a broader area. But so if we take this as an upper bound on fertilization, efficacy of fertilization at this site, that if we assume this sort of 100 millimoles per meter squared per year as a sort of order of magnitude for what ocean fertilization might be able to achieve, and I say this isn't probably an upper bound, close to an upper bound, because it doesn't include the macronutrient utilization. If you assumed you could do this over 10% of the ocean, which might be iron limited, that this gives you something like 0.4 of a gigaton carbon per year. Current anthropogenic CO2 carbon emissions as CO2 are on the order of 10 gigatons carbon per year. So this is 4% of current anthropogenic CO2 emissions. And so even if iron fertilization is effective, it will be effective at reducing net emissions or taking up a few percent of emissions. Or another way of looking at that, it will delay the time it takes to achieve the same atmospheric CO2 level by a few percent. So we're talking about a niche player in the best of circumstances. So I think that a central question is storing more CO2 in the ocean a good idea? And you can think about, say, capturing CO2 from power plants and putting it underground. The idea is that, well, we're keeping carbon out of Earth's fluid reservoirs, but the goal of iron fertilization is to transfer CO2 from the atmosphere to the ocean. And I've done some work on the issue of ocean acidification, as have many of the people in this room, where the environmental concern is CO2 in the ocean. And so if the goal of ocean fertilization is to transfer CO2 in the ocean, we have to say, well, is the very goal of this activity a positive one? And right, so the question is, what about ocean acidification? My postdoc Long Kao and I have a paper in review right now, and we took an extreme case just to illustrate the issue. And what we did is we assumed, like as in the early simulations done, I don't know, sometime in the 90s, we just assumed you had idealized iron fertilization. It worked perfectly, and you were allowed to consume all of the phosphate in the mixed layer and export that down using sort of Redfieldian ratios and so on. And so you get the blue line, which is buried under the green line. The red line that's buried under the green line is a case of just the A2 business as usual type CO2 emissions, where you see CO2 going up. The blue line represents the case where you allow iron fertilization to work unrealistically effectively and use up all the phosphate in the surface ocean, and you get some decrease in atmospheric CO2 levels. Now, this is an exaggeration of what you would actually be able to achieve. But the point is here, so the argument that you could possibly improve the, okay, let me move on to the next slide then. The green line says, well, now if we take the additional carbon we store in the ocean, and then we allow the production of carbon credits based on this storage, and then you sell those carbon credits, and that allows somebody with a coal-fired power plant to burn more coal and emit more CO2 into the atmosphere, then you achieve the same atmospheric CO2 level that you would have had in the absence of ocean fertilization, and so that you end up with the same CO2 levels you had before. And so the benefit then is not, if you allow ocean fertilization to sell carbon credits, the benefit is no longer in reducing atmospheric CO2 concentrations, but the benefit is in allowing people to emit more CO2. And so if we make claims about, so one of the claims made by Climos and others in favor of ocean fertilization is that you're transferring CO2 from the biologically active upper ocean into the deeper ocean. And so if you're trying to protect coral reefs, that it might make sense to transfer carbon from the surface ocean to the deep ocean and therefore increase the aragonite saturation level of the surface ocean. And so again, this red line shows the aragonite saturation predicted by the model in the case of just continued business as usual type emissions. The blue line is this unrealistically effective ocean fertilization where you're using it to try to protect the upper ocean. But again, the green line is if you then allow the sale of carbon credits from the stored carbon, that you end up emitting more CO2 and you lose any benefit for the surface ocean. And then and so, okay, I guess this is out of order. So let me go back to the, so by doing the fertilization, you've put more carbon in the deep ocean, and then if you sell the credit, you haven't gained any benefit for the surface ocean. I'm running late on time, and just this is to show pH and aragonite saturation under these two cases. And I guess the main point I want you to get out of this is if this right here represents, in terms of pH and aragonite saturation, the pre-industrial state. And the point that all of these things look fairly similar suggests that any possible benefit in terms of ocean benefit or harm is second order in terms of ocean chemistry. Yeah, so here's, I'll just rush through this, but this is where you're allowed to sell a carbon credit. So basically, with no ion fertilization, this is showing time versus depth. And I lost the things here, but this is a pH change, and so the so basically here's where you're just emitting the CO2. Here's where you use the ion fertilization to bring the carbon deeper, and so you improve the surface ocean conditions, but acidify the deep ocean more. And then if you allow the sale of carbon credits, you get both the acidification of the deep ocean and the same surface ocean results. So I think you could say there is perhaps potential for ocean fertilization to produce a net environmental benefit, but this potential, I'm not saying it would, but there's at least potential for it. But the net environmental benefit depends in part on the socio-political environment in which that fertilization occurs, in that it's conceivable at least that transferring carbon from the near surface ocean to the deep ocean could confer a net environmental benefit. But if the carbon credits are generated by the storage of additional CO2 in the ocean, and this leads to greater fossil fuel emissions, then there appears to be a likelihood of net environmental damage. So, and then there are other issues, obviously, about converting the natural ocean ecosystems into managed ecosystems, as we've done on land. Then also, if we did think that iron fertilization confers a net environmental benefit, there are questions about how we would best go about realizing this benefit, in that if it really is such a good idea, governments just might want to pay ships to sprinkle iron in the ocean, and the idea of using carbon markets to fund this activity and then sell carbon credits might not be the right way to go. And then, there's all broader issues about how we go about managing a finite shared asset, which is the oceans. But anyway, these legitimate concerns about iron fertilization, I believe, have generated an overreaction and an attempt to suppress scientific activity. And we see this with this low effects experiment where while they were sailing out to sea, they were forced to turn around and sail back to port. And then as they were sailing back to port, I think on Monday, they got approval to go ahead with the experiment again. And, there's a bunch of graduate students on this that have their theses dependent on the results of it. And, to yank scientists around like this seems to me a bit unfortunate. So here's my modest proposal, and this is obviously not science, it's politics. But again, I think the issue is that I think companies like Climos and Planktos have made it as if it's the scientists and these companies against the environmental organizations. And I think that allowing these profit-making companies to put scientists in this position has been unfortunate, and scientists in some cases have, through lack of clarity, have allowed this to happen. And I really think that the scientists need to stress that sound scientific information is necessary for making good policy and that is needed to manage the ocean wisely. That, that the London Convention and London Protocol, which has already recognized that intent of an activity is important, in that right now you're under what's being negotiated under the London Convention now is that basically there's a big details of here, but basically the original idea was to let small-scale activities go on, but not large-scale activities, and then you have a bunch of lawyers trying to define what small-scale is, and then if you allow a small-scale, what if a commercial activity wants to do a small-scale experiment every single day and do 1,000 of them a day? How do you define what's large and small? And so it's turned into a big mess. But they made an exception for mariculture in that the fish farming industry didn't want to be prevented from doing their fish farming. And so and since that's a powerful industry, they put an exception that's saying ocean fertilization under the London Convention does not include mariculture. And so the same activity, if you do it with the intent of growing fish, you're allowed to do it. If you do it with the intent of storing carbon, you're not allowed to do it. And so once the lawyers have admitted that intent is important, I think we could expand that to say that if your intent, that there's a distinction between the intent to develop scientific knowledge and the intent to store CO2 in the ocean. So since the London Convention has already, so it's focusing on what constitutes ocean dumping. And I think addition of iron in the ocean with the intent to store CO2 in the ocean represents the attempt to store pollutants in the ocean, which is carbon dioxide. So that I think actions taken with intent to dispose of CO2 in the ocean deserve special regulation. And so my modest proposal is to take intent into account and say that if your intent is to store CO2 pollution in the ocean, that would be considered ocean dumping, and that if you sell a carbon credit or other instrument of value based on the activity, that would be prima facie evidence of intent to dispose of pollution in the ocean. But that if your intent is to further scientific understanding, that then it would be put in the same category as mariculture and not considered ocean dumping. And so you simply say that scientific activity gets placed in the same category as mariculture. And in the case of the first case, your product of doing the experiment is essentially a carbon credit. In the second case, your product is a peer-reviewed paper and hopefully a good journal. So, so my broad message here is that scientific experiments that have an expectation of producing scientific knowledge and no expectation of significant environmental harm should be encouraged. And if the rational concern is widespread commercialization of an activity, then you should regulate the commercialization and not the science. And so to summarize, that it appears to me that increasing ocean carbon uptake through ocean fertilization is not likely to produce a positive net environmental benefit. However, I don't think this has been shown beyond a reasonable doubt, and so I could be wrong. But I think the greater motivation for doing manipulative experiments in the ocean is to establish the basic understanding of ocean processes that we need to manage our ocean commons. And I think that there's no expectation of significant adverse impact from any ocean fertilization experiment that's so far been conceived. And so I would encourage this kind of experimentation, if only just to establish a better scientific basis for understanding our oceans. But I do believe there's a risk of widespread commercial activities that absent appropriate regulations. And so I would just suggest that at this time that sale of carbon credits or activities that lead to sale of carbon credits should not be allowed in the ocean. And then if a scientific experimentation actually establishes that there is net environmental benefit, this ban can always be revisited. So that's where I would leave things.